Over the past few months, I've been running a series of polls on my YouTube channel to create community tier lists, where I will list all of the characters from a game and have you vote as to what tier they go in, between S and F. I first did this with Path of Radiance and then the Binding Blade, and those two tier lists do have their own video. But afterwards, YouTube made a change to the way that its polling system works. You see, previously you could either make a 4-option poll that included images, or a 5-option poll that did not include images. However, because YouTube, in its infinite wisdom, decided 5 was a few too many options for those of us with teeny tiny brains, the number of poll options got cut down from 5 to 4, even if you don't include any images. Personally, I like my tier lists for most games in the series to have 6 tiers: S, A, B, C, D, and F. So the 5 poll option was already less than I wanted, but I had a workaround where I would ask for votes from A to F, and then anyone who scored a high enough value in the A tier would have a runoff poll to determine whether or not they should be in the S tier. But when limited to only 4 options, that becomes a lot less feasible. I considered a couple of workarounds, the most promising of which was to have a runoff for both the S tier and the F tier, but ultimately I decided to avoid the problem entirely by asking my community to rank a game that I think most would agree just does not have any F tier units. That being the most recent title in the series, Fire Emblem Engage. And so this is the tier list that y'all came up with. It should be noted that characters are not ordered within tiers, as that's not something that would be feasible given the parameters of the voting system. I've had a few people take issue with my not ordering characters for the community tier list within tiers, stating that they should be ordered based on how high the percentage was that they ended up in the tier, but that still wouldn't accurately reflect the order that the community feels these characters belong in. If 75% of people voted for Vander in B tier, but only 40% voted for Alchrist in B tier, that doesn't mean that people think Vander is better than Alchrist, simply that they're more confident that he belongs in B tier than they are Alchrist does. But it's possible that most of the votes that didn't go into B tier ended up in A tier for Alchrist, while most of the non-B tier votes for Vander ended up in C tier. Not only that, but the number of people who vote on each character is going to influence the percentages that a character receives. If Vander and Alchrist both got 500 votes for B tier, but Vander got twice as many votes as Alchrist did, then Vander's percentage is going to look lower, even though the same number of people voted for him. Ultimately, the community tier list is never going to be an accurate representation of a single person's thoughts on the game's meta, and I don't think it should be taken as such. Instead, I tend to look at it as more of a general idea of where the community mindset is around ranking these characters. That, and just kind of a fun way to engage with the community. Although based on some of the comments I've been getting, there's definitely some people who find it to be a frustrating way to interact with the community. Personally, I actually think this tier list y'all came up with is pretty good. I have a couple of rankings I take issue with, but honestly, compared to the travesty that was the Path of Radiance tier list, this looks like a fairly standard ordering. And it not only aligns with the majority of my opinions, but also seemingly the majority of larger Fire Emblem community opinions. For comparison, here is my own Engage tier list. I ordered within tiers, and if you're curious for the specific justifications for those orderings and rankings, I did make an entire video on my Fire Emblem Engage tier list, which will be linked below and in the end card. But you'll notice, as far as the tiers themselves are concerned, there's a lot of overlap between your rankings and my own. So this video will definitely be a lot less in-depth than the one I made about your Path of Radiance list. But I still think there's a couple of interesting topics I can use the community tier list as a jumping off point to talk about. And the first one is perhaps the greatest travesty associated with the Engage community tier list. But funny enough, rather than revolving around any of the characters or units in Fire Emblem Engage, it is instead focused on Fire Emblem 7, and specifically the character Heath. You see, because the change to YouTube's policies restricted me to having only 4 options, there was no downside to including images in the poll, so I thought it would be kind of cute to label each tier with chibi art of a unit from the franchise to represent what that tier is supposed to be. This is official art from the Fire Emblem website, Meet Your Heroes, which revolves around the mobile gacha game Fire Emblem Heroes. So for the A or S tier option, I had Har, who is pretty universally considered one of the best units in the franchise. Meanwhile, for D tier, I had Ash, who is, while not on the level of someone like Sophia or Wendy, one of the weaker members of the Three Houses cast. For C tier, I included Joshua, a perfectly serviceable unit held back by the terrible class of Swordmaster. But B tier is where things get controversial. It's actually pretty difficult to think of a character who is universally considered to be B tier. When someone is really good or really bad, the community tends to gravitate around that and recognize it. But if someone is just kind of middle of the road, there's almost always some sort of heated debate about whether they're actually super underrated or no, they're trash because they're not as good as Har. For some reason, the characters whose art I decided to go with for the B tier was Heath from Fire Emblem 7. But that was probably a mistake. You see, while he definitely has his detractors, Heath is one of the stronger units in Fire Emblem 7. He's a flyer with good combat stats, a very small training arc, and the ability to rescue quite a lot of heavy units, due to the fact that he uses the male rescue formula but doesn't have very high con. In my FE7 tier list, I put him in A tier, and there's a decent argument that he is the best non-Marcus combat unit in the game. Although there is some steep competition for that role, with pre-promotes like Pent, Hawkeye, and Harkin, as well as highly available units like Lowen potentially outshining him. Still, if you are in a conversation where you are on the same level of consideration as someone like Pent or Harkin, you're a pretty good unit, and you probably don't deserve to be the face of B tier. So that is mea culpa. I'm sorry to anyone who's a big Heath fan or just at all aware of the Fire Emblem 7 meta. I don't know what came over me, but I probably should have chosen someone else for B tier, like Micaiah. But y'all probably aren't ready for that spicy hot take. But on the topic of people going into B tier who don't belong there, the B tier on the community engaged list was incredibly bloated, to the point where a running theme in the comment section was people joking about haha oops all B tier. Not only that, but the C tier and B tier combined consist of the majority of the cast. Since there was only one character in A tier and two in D tier, anyone who didn't make S made it into either B or C. And to an extent, I can understand how this happened. B tier and C tier are kind of the middle tiers of a traditional tier list, housing the units who are not good enough to be meta-defining, but not bad enough to be generally considered trash. And in fact, a lot of people would comment, I don't really know anything about this unit, so I'm just going to vote B. Putting aside the question of whether people should be voting if they don't know anything about the character, there is a hesitancy in the Fire Emblem community at large to put units in modern Fire Emblem games in lower tiers. Even with my elimination of the F tier, the D tier went mostly unused. And in fact, a common talking point on the internet is that the weakest a unit can be in Awakening and onwards is C tier, usually demonstrated by comparing the strengths of modern units to the weaklings of the Game Boy Advance era, such as Sophia and Wendy, the favorite punching bags of the Fire Emblem community. But I would argue, unless you're going for cross-game comparisons, that this is the wrong way of looking at these units. The more middling members of Engage, like Boucheron and Tamara, are not competing with the absolute trash fire that is Fiona Radiant Dawn. Instead, they're being compared to gods among men like Kagetsu and Ivy, or even perfectly serviceable units like Etier and Alchrist. And with that level of competition, folks like Anna and Bonet look quite bad, and I would argue that is what the D tier, or on lists that include it, an F tier is for. Whenever you call a unit from a modern Fire Emblem game bad, the counter-argument is usually, well, I used them and it didn't softlock me out of the game, or that if you give them enough resources, they can be a primary contributor to your army. And these things can be true, but they're not a counter-argument to a unit being bad. If you invest enough in Sophia, she can have the largest warp range of any unit in Fire Emblem 6. But the place that she starts from is pretty unimpressive. Likewise, I have a video on my channel of Mist killing Deginsia in Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. But similarly, this doesn't disprove her combat being mediocre. With enough skill, practice, and planning, or heck, even just dumb luck, you can use any combination of units to see the end credits on the highest difficulty of any Fire Emblem game. And as such, a unit not softlocking you isn't a disqualification from them landing in D or F tier. Nobody is going to softlock you in Fire Emblem. So yeah, even though the casts of modern Fire Emblem games are generally stronger than the casts of older Fire Emblem games, this doesn't mean that there's no D tier units in those games. Instead, that we should adjust our expectations of what each tier means depending on the game and what the units are competing against. Having a tier list with 5 tiers but leaving one of them empty or nearly empty tells us less than if we filled out all of the tiers with the units that we felt belonged there. And weirdly, this is an attitude that I basically exclusively see within the Fire Emblem community. Pulling up the most recent Pokemon Gen 9 OU viability rankings, we see that the C and D tier are still highly populated, and by Pokemon who are capable of doing some very powerful things, but are outclassed by those listed in S, A, and B tier. Fighting games will often have decently populated mid and low tiers, and there are players who go out of their way to use low tier characters to win tournaments. The Paper Mario challenge running community has tier lists for badges, and very populated lower tiers, but that doesn't mean that these badges are not usable, just that they're outclassed by other ones. Now, it's obviously going to vary from game to game how many units end up in the F tier, as well as how many end up in the S tier. And my own list had a very sparsely populated D tier, with only 5 characters present. But I do think if a character is meaningfully weaker than their competition, either in requiring more resources, having less of a payoff, or just having less availability, then they should be categorized lower than them. Otherwise, what's the point of doing a tier list? Although, the D tier was not the only extremely empty tier that we had on our community list. The only unit to make the A tier was a Leer, with everyone else who qualified for the A or S runoff polls landing in S and by a pretty sound margin as well. And I'll be honest, I chalk this up to the majority of voters simply not reading the voting criteria. On future tier lists, I adjusted the wording in hopes of convincing people to more carefully read how we are voting, specifically by labeling the first option as S tier / A tier and then putting in a giant parentheses, please read criteria. But my suspicion is the reason why people were so averse from voting for anyone but the best of the best into the A / S runoff polls was because they were operating on the assumption that this was a 4-tier system, only putting people into A, B, C, or D, which does make the absence of D-tier units even sillier. Each daily post did clarify in its body how the runoff polls would work, but I suspect many people simply saw the character name and clicked on a voting letter without reading any of the details or criteria. And I don't just think this because no one other than the S tiers got voted for the SA runoff. You see, this tier list was operating in a no DLC setting. My reason for that was that not everyone owns the DLC, and I wanted as many people as possible to be able to vote on the tier list. This meant that I didn't include the 5 Feld Xenologue exclusive characters, but also that I expected the units to be ranked based on their criteria without factoring in the experience you gain from doing the paralogs early, or the various builds that are only possible using DLC emblems or skills from them. I did allow people to factor in the well, since that is something everyone has access to, but anything that came from spending money was something that I excluded from factoring into the tier list. Despite this, and despite every post clarifying it is a no DLC tier list, I got dozens of comments on almost every unit talking about how the reason that they're good is they can inherit Reprisal or Geosphere or something like that. Some characters definitely got more DLC mention than others, such as the famous Vale Soren build, or Chloe being a recipient of a large amount of Paralog DLC. But without fair, every single post had at least one DLC-centric build or comment mentioned. Now, knowing how YouTube commenters are about giving their 2 cents without watching the video, I expected some number of people to ignore or not even read the criteria. But given the frequency of comments, as well as the disparity in A versus S tier, I suspect that the majority of voters did not read the criteria. So if you were one of the few who did, then, thank you, I appreciate it. I'll be honest, I do find it a little bit frustrating how many people just did not follow the criteria, and I'm hoping that the changes I made to the next tier list, the Fates one, will improve this problem somewhat. But for the Engage one, I would say take it with a grain of salt. Some number of votes were almost certainly factoring in DLC when they shouldn't have been. And I wouldn't be surprised if some number of people ended up in B tier simply because people didn't think they were worthy of S. But speaking of units who made it into S tier instead of A, can we talk for a moment about Chloe ending up in S tier? Compared to the rest of the early game cast, Chloe does have somewhat better growths than her competition, especially if you change her focus from physical into magical. But I think the extent to which her growths outclass the other units is wildly overblown. Because sure, she's one of the best units to give favoritism to before you enter Brodia, but investing in someone like Louis or Celine will give you similar, if slightly worse, results. And they can potentially offer more for you in the short term, as bulk or the ability to hit on resistance are unique qualities. Chloe has her own unique quality in Flight, but I think the Flight applications in early game Engage are pretty limited. On her join map, it's definitely nice to be able to go across the river, but far from necessary to clear the map. And Chapter 5, likewise, doesn't really have anything that benefits flyers. Being able to travel through bushes or over the walls in Chapter 6 is quite nice, and every map in the Brody arc has some obstacle that flying over would be good. But once you get out of the early game, flight is no longer a unique attribute of Chloe's. In fact, anyone can become a flyer if you spend a seal on them. Chloe getting it for free is definitely a benefit, but I don't think it does as much heavy lifting as people claim. I'll be honest, I think the majority of early flyers are overrated, and Chloe does not seem to be an exception to this trend. Flight is extremely powerful in Fire Emblem, especially the entries that have pair up or rescue dropping, as it enables strategies that you can't do with only grounded units. But especially in Reclass Emblem, where flight is easier than ever to accomplish, being a fast but frail peg just isn't the selling point it used to be. And when comparing Chloe to her competition in S tier, I really don't think she can measure up. Even if given all of the favoritism that you have available in the early chapters, she's going to be lagging behind the powerful mid-game squad, and even potentially the Brodians. And I also just don't like the idea of automatically assuming she gets the favoritism. There are plenty of reasons to invest those same resources into units who offer unique niches, like Alir, From, or Celine. Because even if their raw combat isn't as powerful as a trained Chloe, you kind of get your bases covered insofar as raw combat is assumed by Ivy, Pandreo, Kagetsu, Marin, Panette, just the whole damn squad. This, I guess, potentially also ties into what I mentioned about criteria and DLC, because I think a lot of people were operating under the assumption that Chloe was also getting 7 maps worth of Paralog experience, and if that's the case, she might measure up closer to the S tier units. I still don't like putting her there because it assumes she's given all of those resources, and I don't think that's automatic. I mean, I don't even think she's the de facto best user of them, but even if she were, it's still an investment that I think should be factored into evaluations. On the other end of things, I was quite surprised to see just how low Linden and Saphir ended up. I would have chopped it up to people valuing availability more than me, but Goldberry, Vale, and Mavier all ended up a tier above the Old Lady and Old Man. Vale I can write off as people factoring in the DLC when they shouldn't have, as well as potentially overvaluing the Soren build. Don't get me wrong, it is strong, but I think it's a little bit overhyped. as there are plenty of other units who can effortlessly sweep maps if given the correct emblem and skill combination. Mavier and Goldmary, however, stick out as odd. I know a lot of people really like Goldmary because of Brave Assist Dual Assist, but I think Brave Assist Dual Assist is actually pretty bad. It's an unreliable chance to add a marginal amount of damage at a point in the game where most of your units should be one-rounding anyway. Really not worth a deployment slot, even as a filler unit. I'd much rather just have a 6-mover with reposition. As far as Mavier is concerned, I just don't think being a filler unit for 6 maps is worthy of the B tier. I know a lot of people talk about how you get an extra deployment slot at the same time he joins, so you might as well use it on him, but you could also use it on someone else. And even if we assume he's force deployed for all 6 of those maps, Mavier is not doing a primary combat role. He can be a mounted repositioner, or he can be a flying staffer, especially since he has staff proficiency so he can use Warp and Griffin. And he does pretty alright combat with the Shining Bow as well. But not only are these roles kind of just minor conveniences as opposed to being a staple on your team, but they also don't separate him from Linden, who he's supposedly an entire tier better than. Linden also has staff proficiency, and he's been around for longer than Mavier. If you want another flying warper, Linden is going to be the better choice simply because he's around for more chapters. Yeah, you could just use both, but if you're using both, then isn't the guy who joins earlier better than the one who joins later? And while we're at it, Saphir is basically just a slightly weaker version of Panette who joins a few chapters later. I think the availability is her biggest issue, but y'all put Panette in S tier. Isn't Panette number 2 at least worthy of B? I mean, certainly more so than Vale and Mavier are. I wouldn't be upset at B or C for all 4 of these units. It's the disparity that confuses me. On my own list, I have Mavier and Linden both in B, and Saphir and Vale both in C, because I place more value on the filler staffer than I do on the filler combat unit. But because I ordered my tiers, you can see that Linden I have directly above Mavier, whereas Saphir is directly above Vale. Because in my mind, they fulfill the same roles, so the one who shows up sooner is going to be better at it. It's far from the biggest issue in the world, but it is the placement that most stands out to me, so I wanted to talk about it. But beyond that, I feel like I've said everything I want to talk about. You can see the 2 lists side by side if you want to know what minor quibbles I have, such as Amber and Citrine being underrated because people can't appreciate their min-max stat lines, or Yunaka and Alcrest getting glazed because people like RNG-reliant strategies. But none of these are surprising or significant enough to devote a section of the video to. So I guess I'll just close by saying, at least we all agree Bunet is awful, right? But you know who's not awful? My patrons! So, thank you, Eris, Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Karosa, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Ellen B, Girlboss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Calamity Callie, Theythom, Andu, Reflect, A Clever Username of Lies, Guigi555, YLO1, George Grenville the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Arvis, Tailored Muffin, Floahay, Faulty Videos, Lyra, Toaster But Really, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Just Riley, Bell Wenska, Dicyke, Ginger, Root Beer Pants, Queen Elizam, Aerith Emblem, Adele, Gabe the Green, Control Dages, Roman Chromantic, Knick Knack Hammersmack, SUP, Caius Cole, Some Trades, Heisticlop, and especially my Jakins, Autumn Kelsey, and Lilzabeth. Your support means the world to me, and it makes it possible for me to pump out videos like this on the schedule I have. If you're interested in supporting your channel, or just getting your names in these cool credits, then there is a link to my Patreon in the video description. But please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. Free ways to support the channel include clicking that like button, the subscribe button, and ringing that bell! And of course, comments always boost me in the algorithm. Speaking of which, rather than including a comment code word, I would like people to indicate they made it to the end of the video by including a section in their comment arguing why Boucheron actually belongs to be in the top of S tier. S+ tier, in fact. That's all I've got for now, so I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.